Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Bill Harris. I'm doing my first Facebook Live event, so bear with me if I get tangled up technically. But I'm going to try and go over a couple of recent studies that have been reported in the national press and in the New England Journal on omega-3 fatty acids. But before I get to that, I want to bring you greetings from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is where I am right now. Sunny day, as you can see in the back, sunny but cold. A little bit about my background. I have a PhD in nutrition in the University of Minnesota, and during my postdoctoral years, I was with Dr. Bill Connor in Portland, Oregon, and I got introduced to omega-3 fatty acids in the late 1970s working with Bill Connor. We did our early studies on the effects of omega-3 on lipoprotein metabolism in humans because we were very interested in the effects of dietary fats on lipid levels, cholesterol levels, triglyceride levels. And so most of my, I guess my first 3 NIH grants were about omega-3 levels, and rather the effects of omega-3 on different lipoprotein metabolism aspects. After that, I got interested in omega-3 levels. We developed that's called the omega-3 index, which measures the omega-3 level in red blood cells, and we got interested in using that as a predictor of disease to see how people who had high versus low omega-3 levels had developed different diseases. So the last 2 grants that I had were actually studying relationships between omega-3 levels and disease outcomes. So that's been my short history of my career. We started a company called OmegaQuant, which is where I am at the moment. And OmegaQuant is a laboratory that does research work on omega-3 on fatty acids in general, as well as working for different clients who want omega-3 levels measured, consumers as well as researchers and physicians. So that's a little bit about me. As I said, I've been interested in omega-3 and following the field for between 35, 40 years now. So it's something that's really been in my blood. These 2 new studies that came out, I think are really come along after about a 10-year drought in the omega-3 field, where we haven't seen really good home run type studies like we've seen published, just reported last Saturday at the American Heart Association in Chicago. So let me talk about the 2 studies. I'll first start with a study called VITAL. VITAL is the largest omega-3 intervention study that actually gave omega-3 versus placebo. That's been done yet. It surpasses the JELIS trial, which was around 21,000 people. This is 25, almost 26,000 people, all from the United States. VITAL was designed to ask the question, if you give people omega-3 or you give them vitamin D, and will that have an effect on their risk for heart disease or cancer? That's a very simple question. There's a lot more details. VITAL was again, done just in the United States. It enrolled people who don't have a history of cancer, don't have a history of heart disease. So in that sense, it's what we would call a primary prevention trial, meaning that's trying to prevent the first evidence of disease. It enrolled around 26,000 people. They were men over age of 50, women over the age of 55. And again, they couldn't have a history of these other diseases. They were then randomly assigned, just by chance, to one of 4 different treatment groups. One group got omega-3, one group got vitamin D, one group got both vitamin D and omega-3, and one group got neither one, what's called a placebo, double placebo. So 2 agents, they didn't know whether they were omega-3 or they were vitamin D. So you've got 4 different groups. We can ask questions about the effects of vitamin D and of omega-3 with a study of that design. I'm not going to go over the vitamin D results. That would be perhaps for another day. but simply to say there was not much of an effect on vitamin D. There was an effect on the cardiovascular endpoints, though, and that's, I think, what's most interesting. I think it's important to remember that the dose that was used of omega-3 in the VITAL study was around 840 milligrams a day. One capsule of the pharmaceutical agent we call Lovesa in the United States, called Omacor in the rest of the world. It's a 1,000 milligram capsule, again, containing 840 milligrams EPA plus DHA as ethyl esters. So that's the product that's been used in many studies over the last 10 years. And also the dose, about 1 capsule a day. And so this is, actually, frankly, I was not expecting too much from the study because that's kind of a low dose. And other studies that have used that dose have not been successful of late. So I was expecting a neutral outcome, and surprised to find that there actually was a beneficial effect. Now, and one of the primary beneficial effects was a 28% reduction in risk for heart attacks. Now, you may have heard in the news, and this is the way it came across in the press, that VITAL was a neutral or a negative. It didn't work. Fish oils didn't work was the conclusion. And that's, I think, an unfortunate reading of the data. I'll tell you how that happened, where that comes from. When people researchers design big studies like this that go for 5 years, it's how long the study, actually, it probably took 5 years to plan it and 5 years to do it. They have to pick what they call a primary endpoint. The one thing that they think their drug or nutrient in this case is going to affect. And they then define that endpoint up front and they start the study. And many times in cardiovascular research, they pick what's called a composite endpoint, which means it's a endpoint that includes several different diseases. For example, it could include heart attacks, it can include strokes, it can include maybe having angioplasty or having a coronary artery bypass graft, CABG treatment. Maybe it includes being hospitalized for a heart attack. Though that would be a composite endpoint. In this particular study, in VITAL, their composite endpoint was heart attacks, strokes, and what they called cardiovascular disease mortality, death from any kind of cardiovascular disease. So they add those three together and call that their primary composite endpoint. And in point of fact, when they look at that particular endpoint after 5 years of follow-up, comparing the placebo group to the omega-3 group, they found that there was an 8% reduction in risk for that particular composite endpoint. But it wasn't statistically significant. Now, we've all heard statistically significant. What does that mean? In this particular case, it means that kind of a difference, an 8% difference, could have happened by chance. And the chance would be one chance in about 4. So one chance out of 4, that could have been a random finding. That's not good enough for most scientific research, where we have basically, by convention, accepted the idea that statistically significant has to be less than one chance in 20. So this 8% reduction in the major endpoint of the VITAL study was not statistically significant because it might have been caused by chance. But if we look at the components of that primary endpoint, that composite endpoint, one of them is heart attacks. And interestingly, there was a 28% statistically significant reduction in risk for heart attacks in the people that got the omega-3. That's a positive finding. That's a good finding. There was no effect on stroke, and there was no significant effect on cardiovascular disease mortality, the other two components. So when you blend them all together, put them in the same pot, it comes out that there's net no effect. But if you really look at the details, you see that heart attacks were reduced by nearly 30% in people that were given only 840 milligrams of DHA and EPA. That's a fantastic outcome, in my view. There's a couple of other interesting outcomes. One of them was an analysis the researchers did looking at people who reported eating less than 1.5 servings of fish a week compared to people who are eating more than 1.5 servings of fish a week. Obviously, fish is a primary source of omega-3 fatty acids. So the question was, well, are people who have essentially lower levels of omega-3, which would be those who are eating less fish, did they benefit any differently from people who are eating more fish? And as it turned out, yes, they did. When you look at forgive me for just looking at my notes on this one, I can't remember how this one turned out exactly in terms of real numbers. Yeah, those people who were given the 1 capsule of Lovesa, which was the omega-3 product that was used, had a 29% reduction in risk for their composite endpoint. So this primary endpoint that mixed all these endpoints together, that was significantly reduced, 29%, but people, again, who were in that low fish intake group that got Lovesa had a 40% reduction in risk for heart attacks. That's spectacular. That basically says that if you have a lower blood omega-3 level, which is what people who eat less fish have, giving omega-3 gives you more benefit. This is not a surprising outcome. But it does confirm the fact that really it's levels that are important in this experiment. Omega-3 levels is really what's critical, because you certainly, if you start with a low omega-3 and you add 900 roughly milligrams a day, you get quite a bump in your omega-3 level. Another finding that was surprising that really I think has to be considered tentative because the numbers were so small was effects in African-American patients, or not patients, subjects. There were around 5,000 African-Americans in the VITAL study. And those that were randomized to the omega-3 treatment actually had only 3 heart attacks during the whole 5-year period in that group, compared to 39 heart attacks in the placebo group of African Americans. So these are really very small numbers, pardon me. But it's a huge reduction in risk, a roughly 77% reduction in risk in African Americans given omega-3. This is the kind of thing that would be actually what they call hypothesis generating. The hypothesis would be that African American individuals are particularly sensitive to the beneficial effects of omega-3. So this, I think some next study ought to be focused just on African Americans and see what the effects of omega-3 are in that group. Cancer was another outcome in the VITAL study we didn't talk about. There really wasn't much effect of cancer, so I won't go into that. Overall, VITAL, I think, was a positive study. There's mixed outcomes. Some endpoints were not affected. Some important ones were, and I think we need to remember that. Secondly, there was a study called Reduce It that was presented last Saturday at the American Heart Association. And Reduce It was, if there's a home run in the omega-3 story, it's the Reduce It study. Reduce It differed quite a bit from VITAL in many ways. First of all, Reduce It used a different product. In VITAL, the product was Lovesa, which is again, an FDA-approved pharmaceutical that gives 840 milligrams of EPA and DHA per capsule, and 1 capsule was used in VITAL. In Reduce It, 4,000 milligrams of EPA only was used. So it's 4 times the dose of omega-3 fatty acid. That, I think, is critical in the difference in outcomes in these studies. Secondly, as I mentioned, the product that was used has just EPA instead of EPA plus DHA. And so that's an interesting facet of this. We don't know if DHA is what was in the mix, if that would have given the same benefits or not. We can't tell. We'll know that in about a year when a new study comes out. In the Reduce It study, everybody in the study was on a statin drug, unlike the case in VITAL. They had to be on statins. Actually, the average bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol level was very good. It was around 75 milligrams per deciliter in this group. And triglyceride levels were a little bit elevated, up at around 216 milligram per deciliter. So that's the average levels of LDL and triglyceride in the Reduce It study. Also in Reduce It, you had to have either a history of coronary heart disease or you had to have risk factors for heart disease to get in the study. So it's a very different patient population than the generally healthy group that was studied in the VITAL study. Size of study was different. There were about 8,200 people in the REDUCE-IT study. There were about 26,000 people in the VITAL study. So it's a much smaller study, but much higher risk individuals. And placebo differed. What you give as a placebo may or may not make a difference. It shouldn't. In the VITAL study, olive oil, 1 capsule, 1 gram of olive oil was used. In the REDUCE-IT study, 4 capsules or 4 grams of a unabsorbed oil called mineral oil was used, and that may or may not have had an effect. I don't think it did myself, but that's something we can discuss in a later time. Similarities, both studies, VITAL and REDUCE-IT, used pharmaceutical omega-3 products, both FDA approved. Both are used for the treatment of very high triglyceride levels. That's what their current indication is for. So they're very similar in that regard. And thankfully, the cardiovascular outcomes that were tracked were very similar between the 2 studies, so we can sort of compare them there. They were also similar in the fact they both were about a 5-year follow-up, meaning they followed people, looked at the effects over 5 years. Studies I'd like to see would be 10, 15, or 20 years long, but that's kind of on my wish list. Probably not going to happen. What were the major findings of REDUCE-IT? Well, as I mentioned, I think this was the home run of omega-3s really over the last several decades. And it was remarkably successful. The primary endpoint was a study. It was also a composite of a variety of different cardiovascular type endpoints. That was reduced by 25%. And if you look at each of the individual components of the composite endpoint, heart attacks, strokes, having to have coronary artery bypass graft, PCI, all these things, everything was significantly reduced by the 4 grams of Vascepa in the REDUCE-IT study. So this study was really a spectacular success. On top, I think part of the spectacularness of it was everybody was already on a statin, so the benefits of statin had already been applied. I think I'll read a quote from the director of the study, the PI on the study, lead author. His name is Deepak Bhatt, and he's the executive director of interventional cardiology at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. In his opinion, he said, this is the biggest development in cardiovascular prevention since statins were introduced. And there's some merit to that. He hopes that these results will be practice changing, that doctors will utilize this treatment in their heart patients. And I'm sure that will happen because, again, Vascepa is it's pure EPA. It's completely safe. And unlike many other heart drugs, which have serious side effects, the omega-3s have virtually no side effects. So they're very easy to take. They're relatively cheap in comparison. They don't interact with other drugs, so there's no concerns about that. And they have many other benefits besides just heart, in my view. So what do we do with the news we have here? The simple answer is that omega-3s do work, and it's a matter of dose. That's what I take it. Dose makes a big difference. Here in the REDUCE-IT study, 4 grams a day. In the VITAL study, 840 milligrams a day, which still worked somewhat, but not as well as 4 grams. That's not surprising. Dose has always made an effect. The dose makes the drug, or the dose makes the nutrient in this case. And that's self-evident, I think. The omega-3 index is a measure I mentioned earlier of omega-3 status, and it was not measured directly in either one of these studies. But based on evidence from our research, I would think that the average level of omega-3 in the VITAL study, the general population study, was roughly 4%. We recall that 8% omega-3 index is what we consider a target, healthy cardiovascular target. So roughly about 4% is where they were, if they're like most Americans that age. And taking 1 capsule of Lovesa generally will increase their omega-3 index 1.5 to 2 units. So they might have got 5.5 or 6 on average. So they're still well below the 8% target. Still got some benefit, which is good. Could they have had more benefit? I think there's evidence for that. In the Reduce It study, again, they did not measure the omega-3 index directly, but given 4 grams a day, 4,000 milligrams, would very likely put the omega-3 index up over 8%. And I think that really is the key for future studies, is to actually titrate or give enough omega-3 to achieve an 8% omega-3 level, and then we see what's the effect on heart disease. My take home then is get your omega-3 levels. That's what, get them up. Do what you can, whether it's by fish or by supplementation with fish oils, krill oils, algal oils, any omega-3, EPA and DHA containing product. Get your omega-3 levels up, and that will reduce risk, because I think the story now is omega-3s do work. It's just you got to get your levels up. That's the important take-home message. I think that really is all I have to say today. I think there are going to be questions. I know there are questions out in the field. We'll come back with another FaceTime Live and talk about frequently asked questions. And if you've got questions, please feel free to post them here, and I'll try to have a look at them and get back to you on them. I hope this has been helpful. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends, and whatever people do with social media, go do it. Thanks for attending. Bye-bye.